Good morning and welcome everyone to What Now? Unpacking the impacts of policy and industry shifts in the EV transition. You are here for MiTalks as a part of the MiVTTP program, which stands for the Michigan Vehicle Technology Transition Impact Project. And today's meeting will just be a facilitated discussion on the current EV political and economic landscape and its potential community level impacts. So I'm going to go ahead and walk us through our time together today. We'll start with welcome and introductions of myself, and I'll talk a little bit about our team members today. Then we will discuss my VTIPS program overview and update, and I'll share some takeaways from our July 22nd MiTalks webinar. And then we'll have a facilitated discussion together on the takeaways from our previous webinar, as well as just wanting to learn a little bit more about your experiences throughout the EV transition as my VTIP participants and community members. And then we'll talk about next steps and go and wrap it up. So you are all welcome, of course. And so as we move ahead, I'll ask you to introduce yourselves in the chat by sharing your name, your affiliation or organization, and what you're hoping to discuss today. I'll also move ahead as we talk about introductions and introduce myself. My name is Latricia Mitchell. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a project manager at EGI, and I support much of the community engagement work that we do on this team for my VTIP and can be found doing strategic planning initiatives as a part of this programming. We also have some other folks here with us today, but I'd like to particularly highlight Nick Thomas, who is the director of Michigan Clean Cities in partnership with Next Energy. Nick is our go-to guy today when it comes to these questions surrounding policy and industry and lived experience on the community level. And so I'm really grateful to have Nick here today as we explore those questions. And so he's also available for questions in case you have some of your own. Thank you again, Nick. I will move us ahead to talk a little bit about my VTIP as a sort of catch up in case you needed a refresher on the program so far and our intended communities and in outcomes. So my VTIP serves 11 communities across the state of Michigan, and I'll read them out in alphabetical order: Detroit, Ecorse, Flint, Hamtramck, Lansing, Lincoln Park, Melvindale, Pontiac, River Rouge, Warren, and Wyandotte. Last year, we engaged each community in a listening session for each community where we got to learn a little bit about community needs and impacts of the EV transition. And now we're squarely in phase 2 in many of these communities, where we provide strategic planning support to strategy teams across each community, which consist of leaders that are thinking about this transition on the local level and how that might integrate in different parts of community life. And we transitioned each of those communities as into phase 3, where we provide workforce training and technical assistance. And some communities are making that transition right now to phase 3, depending on where they are in the program. Overall, our outcomes for my VTIP are simple. We want to understand community needs and impacts of this transition. We want to provide real action plans for workforce training and technical assistance, and overall support community responses to these unique challenges and opportunities that we might face in this transition. We really want to see and promote higher job placement in my VTIP communities. That would include creating more wealth opportunities, creating more sustainable opportunities for employment. We'd like to be able to look at this program and its valuation several years from now and see and report out that communities were beneficially impacted by the work that we did. So that's a little bit of an overview of our programming. So we will move ahead and I'll talk a little bit about our July session, our very first MiTalks webinar, which was called Who's Driving? Auto Industry versus Policy and Electric Vehicle Transition, featuring Dr. Lisa Kruzmark from the Center for Automotive Research. We had a great discussion with Lisa around these many changes in the auto industry, particularly, and really the impact of policy. We've had a lot of questions from community members throughout the last 7 to 9 months and throughout the last year about the shifts, who's in charge between auto industry and policy. And Lisa was able to share some significant research with us about recent auto industry investments and the ever-changing nature of federal and state and local policy and how that might impact future dynamics. Some of these questions are still live, and so we want to share out with you even now the data that we've gotten so far from Lisa's research. That was really helpful to us. And so I'll do a brief recap here. So we talked about 5 different sectors here. I'll start with investment. We've seen that about 80% of recent auto industry investments target electrification, with Michigan and the South leading. There has been some investment in the southern part of the US, of course, on the western side of the country, in California, some other states in that area. But Michigan has still been a state where that investment has been targeted. We also see that this changing policy environment where we see federal and state policies have been reshaping manufacturing and market dynamics. We see shifts in the workforce. These EV transition is driving demand for both technical and engineering workforce skills. We're going to talk a little bit about this today, but there are community level impacts. The communities are experiencing job growth and disruption, which would require targeted local responses. And overall, we see an importance to recognize and support diverse perspectives and needs. An equitable transition in the EVs depends on collaboration across business, government, education, and residents. These are several of the takeaways that we learned and gained from our discussion with Lisa in July. We want to make space for an open discussion here. And if you've joined us since we started, I want to say hello to you, welcome. Please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat and share your organizational affiliation and anything you're hoping to discuss today. We'd love to help you get connected to the work that we're doing in this space. So with that being said, we'll leave the slide up for just a moment so you can take in these takeaways, and then we'll come out so we can see one another. But based on what you see here and what we've discussed perhaps now or just in your MiVTTP programming, what questions do you have? What kind of thoughts does this provoke in you right now? All right. I like to make space for questions in case you have them, and we will do that. But I also have some questions for you. So I'd love to hear more about your insights as community members and get some insights on really just what it's been like for you this year so far as you've pursued and become open to these opportunities. And hopefully this could be a space for you to share out and connect across communities and community impact to think through what you've been learning. So I'm really first curious for you all if recent investments have directly impacted your community or your sector. Can you share positive experiences or specific examples, either positive or negative? And we'll get each of these questions in the chat for you as well as you see and respond to them.
This is Jody. I would say in our area, because of the uncertainty behind all of it, and it could be the economy as well, obviously, but it feels like things have kind of stalled or kind of paused in the manufacturing industry just because, they're not knowing exactly how quickly or if and when EV is really going to take off. And of course, the instability at the federal level with all of that too has not helped. So I would say that's what we are experiencing a lot in the conversations that we're having with some of the manufacturers that we work with.
Mm. Yeah. Has that felt true for others? Thank you, Jody. Have you seen this impact your work so far? I mean, a few different sectors represented here too, so I'm quite curious if this has come up for others. Maybe I should assume it has come up. I think, and even for you, Jody, I kind of would be curious. Has this happened with multiple manufacturers that you've been collaborating with? Have you seen any
Yeah,
positive?
I would say a lot. A lot of it's just uncertainty, I would say, in the economy and in our business, we're working with a lot of grants that come from the federal government. So when, we're kind of getting whiplash from one administration to another with, the ideas behind EV and alternative fuels in general. So, that's what we've experienced, just a uncertainty and a pause in doing anything kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I say that, however, as you know, we're working with MTA and they're, the transit system here in Genesee County. They are fantastic partners, totally forward thinking, and they're moving ahead with transforming their fleet from diesel to hydrogen, and they have some EV vehicles as well. And so we're working very closely with them on trying to get some apprenticeships and trainings built to be able to um, train their incumbent workers on new technologies and keeping them relevant and having the ability to move forward quickly.
Mm. Hey, Joseph, that's great confirmation. Anything you want to share there?
Well, in terms of the industry, we haven't been doing too much outside of just working with Ford Pro and their products. But yeah, we're definitely looking into how we might be able to transition, especially right now, our smaller fleet of vehicles that we use for demand response transit. Um, because right now that's the most cost effective and kind of easiest to transition. Um, yeah, so that's where we're at.
Yeah. I'm curious, Nick, do you have any thoughts on what we talked about so far? Have you seen anything differently than that in your work?
Yeah, no, certainly I'll echo a lot of the work that we do, both at Next Energy and Michigan Clean Cities is certainly grant-based, and I think a lot of the focus has shifted, certainly. So that's been challenging to navigate, but I think from a more of a macro level, like an industry level. Um, I think what you saw if you were, saw the news yesterday with what, Ford was announcing, which was a $2 billion investment into a family of EV vehicles. You have General Motors already has a family of EV vehicles, but continues to invest in that. I think if you look at Europe and especially China, the global industry is still moving forward. And so industry, while in the short term, there is a lot of uncertainty, I think they're fairly confident in the long-term future. It's really, how we help our communities navigate that short-term turbulence. Because I think the long-term vision is there, and it's kind of somewhat of a foregone conclusion that it's going to happen. It's just, we are less certain on the steps and pace, as maybe, Lori pointed out, um, of what that looks like. And certainly, bringing GM back up, there was a plant here in Lake Orion, Michigan, that was supposed to do EVs and is now going to build more traditional vehicles. I think maybe some hybrids, but certainly, gasoline powered rather than fully electric. And so there is some change in strategy, and navigating that has been a challenge for communities, certainly. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's evolving, but I think, just to put all a bow on it, I think the long-term future is certain. The short term is very chaotic.
Hmm. I think that does put a bow on it in a way because it helps us to manage our expectations about the short term. I think, yeah, we've been in lots of discussions, even just amongst my BTIP folks around, yeah, what is the impact to the short term going to be, and what is the value, if there is some, in developing a long-term plan, long-term vision. So it really ties into a lot of what we've been talking about with our strategic planning support. So yeah, we're in the midst of those conversations, and y'all are experiencing them on the ground in real time. So yeah, thank you for your insights. I have another question for you as a group, and I'll put it in the chat as well. But when you think about more electric cars, buses, or micromobility options on the roads, what kind of opportunities or challenges do you think that this could bring to people where you live and work? And you might live in a community where this is quite prevalent, in which case you might be able to share about those insights. And if you don't yet have those experiences, I'd be curious to see what you think about that. I'm very comfortable with silence, so I always leave about 10 seconds or so before I move on or add some more context when I facilitate. So no pressure if you don't think that you have some insights to share here. Um, but I'll always turn it into a question. So I'll instead just turn to my friend Nick and grill him a little bit about what kind of opportunities or challenges you have seen in your work and when it comes to these opportunities on the road.
Yeah, certainly. So, I'll kind of take it from the car and bus perspective first. So the one thing to keep in mind, whether the vehicle is, diesel or gasoline, hydrogen or electric, like um, they're still vehicles, right? And so I think there's kind of a double-edged sword to that. So one, that, it's relatively normal. There's really no difference in experience um, for the end user, right? So people actually using these modes of transit. I would say at the same time, that also means, a lot of times we get so caught up in the fact that they are cleaner technologies, which is great, certainly from the local pollution and particulate level. I mean, that's the biggest win, right? Um, is that they still have sort of, congestion um, problems in the sense that, a vehicle, electric vehicle is replacing one gasoline vehicle and one, electric bus is replacing one diesel bus. So there's still the macroeconomic or macro logistical things in play that we still need to, think through. It's not like it's a magic wand and we solve everything. So, it's just something that, I want to put at the back of everybody's mind. And that's where the micromobility becomes really a solution where um, we can start to change how people get around at a more granular level. And so um, it doesn't always work for every community. There are certain communities that are very much sort of the on-demand ride share, which does help certainly for um, more point-to-point operations or less route-based options. And then you have, things like bikes and scooters, and I think anybody who's lived in a community with shareable bikes and scooters, we've seen some of the rise and fall of that and some of the benefits and pitfalls of those in terms of how those interact with the larger community. But um, certainly those are all challenges. And what, again, just to, I'll say put a bow on everything because I want to make sure we always have a solid understanding. What I'm trying to get at is, although these solutions are pieces of the puzzle, if we don't change the macro level, we'll still have problems that we need to address. So these are all just pieces of that puzzle rather than, sort of the end all be all solution. And we just need to keep that in the back of our mind.
That's a great comment from Jody about infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure would we need in Michigan to support it? And maybe what are we missing to support a broader EV adoption statewide?
I can give a great example. In my job, I had a conference that was in Upper Michigan, and one of my fellow directors from the Detroit area had an electric car and got halfway to the conference and ran out of charge and had to be towed and then had to find a charger near where we were in Upper Michigan in order to, make it home basically. So there's just not the infrastructure of chargers that I've seen in the region that I travel, even let alone Upper Michigan, and we travel there quite a great deal too. So hybrid, totally, totally, could be convinced at that, but solely electric, I'm not there yet.
Yeah, that sounds like a very stressful experience for your
Yeah.
colleague. And I probably wouldn't endear most people to making that their next step. And it seems like there would need to be like statewide, far-reaching infrastructure, even to the corners of the state, because Michigan has it's a pretty significant span. So you need to be able to get around. Yeah. hmm
Yeah, just from my house to in Lapeer to Flint every day, I could do that very easily. It's just those extra trips.
yeah. Nick, how long have you been an EV owner?
That's a great question. 2018, I think.
7 years, okay.
So I've done many a road trip, yes. Never run out of charge, but I've gone, um, nearly 1,000 miles round trip, winter, summer, up to the UP and back from down here, through Canada. So I've kind of seen the good, bad, the ugly. Thankfully I've had a pretty easy experience. I know I've heard a lot of horror stories, but certainly we talk about some of the challenges going back to the first sort of prompt there, Latricia, is with the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure funding, or NEVI as it's commonly referred to. Michigan was certainly a big investor in that as well, which places certain requirements for not only speed but quantity and amenity and location of fast chargers. And certainly in the state of Michigan being a very long state, right, in a state that's heavily relies on tourism, we'll want to make sure, to Lori's example, that we have chargers in very strategic locations for people to be able to do what it is that they want to do in their vehicles without really having to think about it too much. And I think with the winding down and in some cases just complete dismantling of the NEVI program, I know each state kind of treats it a tiny bit different, so that's why it's throw an asterisk on there. It has been a challenge to realize that future. Now, to that end, I think private industry has actually outside of the NEVI program, because if you look at the stations that were installed without any sort of federal funding from the NEVI program, have actually increased quite a bit. I don't know the exact number, but a substantial amount. So we are seeing, private industry starting to fill some of that gap, but there, to Lori's point, there's a long way to go. And so infrastructure is key. I would say closely tied behind that is education. Whether that be how is my electric vehicle different from maybe other models, and how do different climate and driving styles affect it as well, and how much does that really matter based on what I'm trying to do. So yeah, certainly it's been an interesting journey as an EV owner. Like I said, very very fortunate, haven't had any big time issues, but you hear it and sometimes you come across minor hiccups, and they can be frustrating. Yeah.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, I think so. I'm not an EV owner, full disclosure, not yet, but maybe just in this line of work, I've also heard a lot of horror stories. So I don't feel shocked by Jody's story, but I do feel disappointed, that there isn't infrastructure to support someone's needs. So I'm also equally intrigued by the fact that that hasn't been your experience. So I guess it's helpful just to also have just a diverse set of stories to inform our perspectives as we make these decisions. But I think it does seem true, no matter what, that our communities need more support, they need more clarity, need more information about how to effectively charge and maintain those charges in their community. So we talked a little bit about this, but it does lead me to my next question for you. And that might I'd like to hear from folks about their community too. So you're here because you represent the work you do, but also the community in which you serve. And so I'm quite curious, how do people in your community at this stage feel about electric cars and infrastructure? Have you sensed that folks are interested, unsure, or hesitant? Of course, we see on the municipal level and city level many changes that we can make, and they don't always require community buy-in. But we're also interested to know, have you seen in your communities a level of openness to EVs and infrastructure changes? What have you seen so far? And Joseph, I know that I don't know if you're a Flintstone by nature, but I'm also curious to hear your experiences at MTA. If you've heard anything from community folks since you've joined the team.
Yeah, I'm not a native Flintstone. I actually commute back and forth between East Lansing and Flint for my job. So, yeah, but I think from the community, there's definitely some interest. I know when I first started this fellowship, we were talking with the city of Flint, um, a little bit about wanting to provide the community with some charging infrastructure, possibly, as we were looking at our own fleet, maybe providing some public charging stations at our facilities. Um, I think generally what I've heard though, especially since the change in the administration, is a lot of hesitation about the costs of installing the infrastructure, at least from those who would be responsible for that end of it. Um, and that's kind of where we are as an agency right now too. And that's my responsibility right now, is to be figuring out if those costs are kind of prohibitive at this point to us doing a full-fledged transition.
Yeah. Have you gotten to the point of getting a sense of that bottom line? Like, how much, under what conditions, or maybe is it just a certain time frame that you're familiar with, Justin?
Um, it's it so far, it's not going to be the immediate flip of the switch to all electric fleet. And what we're looking at for costs, as long as we can take hold of some incentives, through consumers' energy, um, or federal grants just for being able to replace our fleet. We can do like small investments, one or two vehicles at a time being replaced. But I'm still working on some of those numbers for sure. And I've been attending a lot of these seminars, webinars, and meeting with people to try and get some good ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
maybe one thing I'd like to add to that too, a lot of what we see in the clean cities world and next energy is, communities or companies, certainly even individuals, but maybe less, less of a concern, but certainly communities, municipalities, and companies will often acquire the electric vehicle first, thinking that that is the hard part, and then later realize that the actual hard part was the charging infrastructure side, especially if you're running a depot model, which many companies and municipalities do, where they recharge or refuel at their home base. And you know the cost of rapid charging outside of having your own personal level 2 charger at your depot or warehouse or whatnot, is about 4 or 5 times, the electricity rate. So it's certainly, while it is cheaper than gasoline, you certainly start to feel the burn, especially if you paid more for your electric vehicle. And so, that's why we always recommend to have at the warehouse or at the lot or at the depot level 2 charging. And, a fast turnaround on that can be, 2 to 3 months, right? That would be, really fast, especially when you're talking about the scale of it. I mean, we've seen larger scale operations, depending on what infrastructure upgrades need to happen, from a utility perspective. In some cases, depending on the scale of your operations, it can be a year, 2 years. It's crazy to think about. But it's just sort of the state of the business. And so we see a lot of electric vehicle owners at that sort of fleet scale that have all these electric vehicles, and they either can't charge them, or they have to rely on more expensive public charging for quick charges. And one thing I think that is beneficial to this conversation to say not all hope is lost. There are a lot of new companies now that I basically like to say are test the water companies, um, and also bridge companies. And what I mean by that is there are chargers which you can basically now um, rent a cargo container full of batteries, or a distributed charger system where you have one really strong connection to the grid, and then this charger can remotely be transported to other locations to act as a stand-in charger, meaning while I'm waiting for my professional utility installation, or if I'm trying to see if there's enough demand to put in a full charger, or if, this, that, and the other thing. There are some bridge companies now that can help with that problem that didn't exist, even 2 years ago. And now there's a small handful, and they're all pretty compelling. So all that is to say that there is a problem, and I think there's a disconnect, and there's a large part of that is a miscommunication between utilities and manufacturers. So something to be aware of.
Yeah, I wish that there were more clarified opportunities to make those connections for folks and community on the community level to those providers. Because I mean, even just the intel that you're sharing, Nick, is so high value and so critical to the decision-making process. Obviously, that's what we're doing here. That's what my VTIP is for. But I also just think I wish it were more intuitive of a process for consumers on the community level. So just thoughts and dreams for our future and our communities. I think that we'll make space for one more question and then pause for just to see if there's any remaining thoughts before we wrap up today. So I think of our remaining questions, I will ask if a little bit about the job shift. So I will put that question in the chat to see if there's any insights or curious things you might want to share. So what challenges have you encountered or heard of in preparing for the skill shift? By that, I mean reskilling or retraining required by electrifications, and what resources would help most? Um, I'll make space for folks to share questions things you might have heard in response to this question, but I'm also curious to, of course, hear Nick's insights on what you might be learning and hearing about the skill shift required by EVs and the EV transition. So I'll pause in case there are questions, and then I'll pass it to Nick for his thoughts. Thanks, Scott. Okay.
Okay, so I will jump in if nobody has any questions. So on the reskilling side, so we're seeing a lot of movement, I'll say, on the technician side. So we've seen a lot of really great, technical training programs that deal with vehicle maintenance, and that's probably the biggest thing. And why I say that's probably the biggest thing is because from the manufacturing side and the engineering side, there's a pretty solid pipeline already. Where there's a massive deficit, and I think it will only grow larger as EVs become more popular, is sort of the vehicle maintenance technician side of the house. And that's still largely true for internal combustion as well. But it's I'll say more pointed for electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, basically anything that's electrified. So certainly there's a lot of opportunity out there. And I think, one thing that I would share with communities broadly is, individuals looking to break into the automotive repair space and maintenance space. There is a niche that does pay more than traditional automotive technician work by going into specializing in electrification. But I think, broadly than that, I think it helps for the community, at least at a high level, to understand like what is, the main differences between being an internal combustion technician and a electric vehicle technician. And the biggest is around safety. And that might sound obvious, but at the same time, these are high voltage vehicles. And so basically anything above 50 volts is enough to kill you. And these vehicles are anywhere from 280 to 800 volt is what's available on the market here in the US. I think the bleeding edge is around 1200 volt systems. So you can imagine if things go awry in the repair process, if a procedure is not followed, if a vehicle is not treated with respect in doing certain operations, that they can have pretty serious consequences. You think about a traditional vehicle, internal combustion vehicle, it runs off of a 12 volt architecture, and it has for the past 80 some odd years. And we're starting to see some newer vehicles with 48 volt systems. And sometimes you'll hear them referred to as mild hybrids. And 48 volts is no mistake. That is, it's a multiple of 6, and it is also just below that threshold. So while not safe to play with per se, it is strategically under that 50 volt threshold. But, you know, certainly the education piece of that is important because the maintenance of electric vehicles at a macro level is much less. I think we're seeing a lot of short-term, you know, learning curve type maintenance things. But dealing with the battery and the motor, the inverter, all of these are low wear items. You know, compared to internal combustion, there are fewer parts to be replaced. But you know, as far as great programs, there are at Washtenaw Community College, there are great programs. Michigan Tech, we've worked with previously. There are some great high voltage programs. And it's really more around how to operate around these vehicles safely. And they're very, I'll say, simple things and, you know, very important yet strategically, you know, placed pieces of equipment that need to be understood of how they work. And then working on these vehicles is relatively straightforward from a technician standpoint. Um, but it's so critical to understand the safety implications. And I'll say this just to wrap a bow on it is not every auto repair facility is fully, and certainly not every fleet owner and operator is fully aware of the things that they should be doing to keep their employees safe. And they are very simple and low cost things that they can do. And that is, it's unfortunate. And a lot of it is, you know, just because they weren't told. So, you know, not necessarily a fault of their own, but.
Hmm. Wow. EV safety is imperative. Employee safety also seems very critical. And
Yeah.
so just as a follow-up, would you say that there needs to be policy improvement to be mindful about providing opportunities that are safe and make room for that, or do you say those are already in place?
I would think from a policy standpoint, and from a standards and regulatory standpoint, all of that has existed for quite some time. It evolves slightly every so often, but all of that is well documented and implemented. It truly is just the education and application of the knowledge and standards that are already out there. And again, it is, you know, by and large, it is just a failure of communication.
Wow. Lots of needs on the table as I hear you talking. Of course, I'm thinking, well, wow, what can we do to help? Like, there's just a lot of opportunities to make an impact, hopefully, and to inform. So, yeah, thank you so much, Nick, for your insights, and thanks to each of you for sharing your thoughts and your questions about your experience. Yeah, thank you, Annie, one of our incredible research associates who shares some fire safety information resources here for your review. We're going to go ahead and transition. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about next steps, and thank you for your time attending. So coming up next, our next MiTalks session, and we'll transition at that space to sort of a more like a public. We'll be inviting everyone to that space, or this was partially an in-house discussion around MiVTTP community members. Our next session will be called Amped Up as we discuss EV technology and local infrastructure. That will be on September 23rd from 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Looking forward to learning from our speaker and presenter about the different EV technology opportunities and how this can be implemented on the local level. So looking forward to that in September. And I just want to take another moment just to say thank you. Thank you so much to each of you for attending. Thank you for your teams and the great work that you're doing. Thank you to our EGI and Michigan Clean Cities team. It's really been a pleasure to have you and to learn more about what you're learning on the ground. So with all that being said, it's been a pleasure, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, Latricia.